Welcome to this retrospective look at Battlefield 1942. I'll be covering the great memories and experiences that I had with this game. I'll also touch on the ever so popular mods from the time. Get ready for some heavy nostalgia. I'd like to imagine most people viewing know exactly what Battlefield was in terms of gameplay. You have big maps with points to capture. This was the first instalment of the Conquest mode that we know and love today. When Battlefield was announced, we didn't really have games with drivable tanks, planes and ships. So when the game launched, it was mind-blowing to experience such gameplay that let you commandeer vehicles so seamlessly in a multiplayer environment. One of the main reasons why I wanted to make this video was to touch on the mod scene. While the vanilla game was fantastic when it first launched, I can comfortably go on to say that the mods were so much better than the base game, but we'll get to that. I'm a big World War II fan when it comes to movies and games. It gets a free pass for me every time. It's the greatest story that will ever be written. I can never have enough World War II content in my life, and that's the reason why 1942 is one of my favourite games. Coming from PS2 gaming in 2002 after getting my first decent PC, Battlefield was a game-changing experience. The scope that Battlefield offered was unlike anything I'd seen yet. Rather than being another soldier, you could become a flying ace, a tanker, or take command of a ship, or better yet, all of the above. Being World War II, you have all the amazing environments you'd expect, which the modern warfare era can't ever hope to compete with. We've got snowy Bastogne, the desert of El Alamein, and the cheery countryside of Bocage. Group this with all of the fantastic vehicular gameplay and you've got hours of gameplay to enjoy. The one thing I will say is though, the game engine of BF1942 was horrible. The REFRACTOR engine gave us nasty gunplay and let's just say, quirky physics. Physics that allowed you to surf on the wings of planes and sandbags that would launch your tank into the air. But that's why Battlefield was so enjoyable. Even though it was presented as a serious war game, it was totally goofy. I'm not sure if it was intended, but all of the voice acting you hear in game just sounds like the actors were in on some joke. During gameplay, all you would hear is other players spamming radio commands for the whole game. I love that stupid sounding German doing the voice work. For example, if you kill Brits they would just go "Oi!"
Shoot! Oi! Ah, you palooka! Oh, damn. Hey! Idiots!
Bloody.
Or when you threw grenades, bodies would fly 20 feet into the air with arms flailing. I might be talking out my arse, but there's a definite dry humour about the entire game. I do wonder if it was intended. With the wonky physics and silly radio commands going off, it's hard to take the game seriously, which is why I love it so much. With no dramatic music or sense of urgency, it was like a friendly skirmish instead of gritty war. Being a mainstream game, the gameplay of 1942 was fairly arcadey. This meant a few gameplay compromises that you would expect, such as weaker gun damage and firing tank shells required lots of arcing to land shots. I actually thought the gameplay was pretty pants, but let me explain before I dish out the nostalgic vibes. At the time, we had good FPS shooters such as Medal of Honor and Day of Defeat. The gameplay felt satisfying with beefy weapons and lovely feedback when hitting enemies. In comparison, 1942's gunplay felt cheap and floaty. All guns had a weird cone of fire and you could never really tell where your bullets were going other than the hit detector. It didn't really help matters when all of the guns had cheap, tinny sounds when you fired them. Even the in-place machine guns felt weak and useless. Nothing felt satisfying outside of heavy weapons like artillery and bombs. The REFRACTOR engine didn't help matters as infantry movement was often slidey and weird, much like those FPS games that feature clunky inertia when you move. Or any game of armour, hey! But that didn't stop us having fun, you just took that as part of the game. Who cares about being barely able to run on a moving battleship when you could take that same enemy battleship, crash it on the nearest island and have your team destroy it? Because the game didn't feature an in-game soundtrack, you could reach a zen-like state in your plane or tank with just a hum of the engines and your machine guns firing. Looking back it was a little crude, but the actual gameplay outshone every quirk. It wasn't until mods came around that I really started enjoying what the REFRACTOR engine could provide. At the time we had Half-Life 1 and the mod scene, and 1942 had a similarly popular mod community. The engine was much more limited, but teams could put together total conversions that included new voice acting, new armies and vehicles. Much like Half-Life 1, there are several popular and not so popular mods. Let's have a look at some. Well, not my favourite, but undoubtedly the most popular was Desert Combat. DC took the same Battlefield gameplay, but introduced modern armies and weapons. The initial versions only had the stock maps of 1942, but later editions would go on to include some amazing maps which suited the first era of the Gulf War. It was a refreshing change of pace coming from the combat of World War II. Remember, all we had were SMGs, rifles and bazookas. For this arsenal to be expanded on with M16s, AKs and multiple launch rocket systems, it was like a whole new game. My favourite vehicle was the AC-130 gunship with the mobile spawn points. I'm sure most of you know, but most if not all of the Desert Combat team were hired by DICE to work on Battlefield 2. It's total conjecture, but I bet Desert Combat was one of the first catalysts for gamers to start enjoying modern combat in the mid-2000s. While 1942 provided all of the tools for varied gameplay, Desert Combat really expanded on what the engine could do. The team included helicopters, Scud missiles and other features such as deployable sandbags. I'll go on record and say DC had the hardest to master but most enjoyable helicopter physics. Helicopters were extremely hard to control, but when you learnt them, you were a king amongst men. You could rain down hell on the enemy team with Apaches, or you could be a master of the Black Hawk, transporting troops from spawn to the front lines. You just knew if you was driving a tank on a large open map, soon as you hear the whir of the rotor blades, you're about to be blown sky high every single time. Without a doubt, my favourite experiences in Battlefield were the transport copters and planes in all of the mods. Remember when I said about the janky infantry physics? Well, Desert Combat and Forgotten Hope featured transport planes where you'd be freely able to move around inside said vehicles. This always involved you being jerked around mid-flight due to the awful physics, and sometimes you would just phase out of the plane and fall to your death if you didn't deploy the parachute. The AC-130 in Desert Combat had a player-controlled rear door opening, so the people who were not seated in the plane would unceremoniously be flushed out if this was open during flight. If the AC-130 was going down and someone didn't open the rear door, everyone would be stuck inside the plane as it plummeted to the ground. It was always grand to see a big kill streak pop up after a 130 crashed, because you knew some arsehole was hogging the door control. Wasn't me. There was one map on the Forgotten Hope mod where the Germans had to be transported on planes to the front line. There were plenty of fixed seats in these planes, but on busy servers you had to stand up in this tiny cabin. Often the planes were so full, players had to try and survive on the wings of the plane as they took off. By the way, this map on Forgotten Hope was Crete. I'll post links of this exact gameplay in the description so you can see it in action. Hilarity always ensued because the pilot would crash or a physics error would cause the plane to blow up. Everyone had a hoot because, like I mentioned, the game had silly voice acting and no music. It was pure unintentional comedy. I would give anything to experience these dumb moments once again. Forgotten Hope was my favourite mod because it was what Battlefield should have been. The damage was ramped up, the classes were as realistic as they could have been. For example, riflemen only had rifles and grenades, and much more. So much work was put into Forgotten Hope it was crazy. The mod team created high quality models and textures so all maps would have dozens of new vehicles and guns to enjoy. Much like waiting for new versions of Half-Life mods, I loved weekends when we get a new version of DC or Forgotten Hope. I still remember the anticipation of waiting for version 0.7 of Forgotten Hope. Christ, waiting for that felt like an eternity back in the day. Unlike the default 1942 game, where Americans had Lee-Enfield rifles of all things, Forgotten Hope had the correct weapons and vehicles for every single army. BF1942 and the mods got me interested in military history more than any book ever could. I was so into World War II at the time. I knew all of the tanks, weapons, and so much more just from playing Forgotten Hope and immersing myself in things back in the time. I loved it. There were so many unique gameplay elements introduced in Forgotten Hope, it would be hard to mention them all. There were hidden weapon kits to pick up, and really sophisticated modifications to the engine, such as realistic armour penetration. You could never make a refractor mod better than the engine's limits, but Forgotten Hope tried its best to break the mould of the original game. Forgotten Hope really was an interactive history book. I can't recommend it enough. I would go on to say, don't even bother with 1942 and just go straight to Forgotten Hope. I'd be here all day listing off the vehicles and weapons and phenomenal maps. Oh, and a quick shout out to Battle Group 42 and Fin Wars. These were great effort mods, but Forgotten Hope was the World War II mod for me. I can only hope the new Call of Duty will get younger people interested in history, like it did with the Medal of Honor, Day of Defeat and Battlefield communities in the early 2000s. My third favourite mod was Eve of Destruction, that yet again introduced and got me interested in Vietnam warfare. Well, Viet Cong was the first game that did that for me, but Eve of Destruction provided an expanded look into that era. It came at an interesting time before Battlefield Vietnam, and during the lifespan of that game, I enjoyed EOD much more than BF Vietnam. It was much more gritty. BF Vietnam had some cool modifications to the engine, but not enough to give up 1942 in the mod scene. I can't recall EOD introducing any standout gameplay elements other than the units and fantastic maps, but it didn't really need to. All we needed were era-specific environments and weapons. The mods all technically played the same, except the toys were different. Perhaps the most ambitious in terms of graphics and concept was Galactic Conquest, which was a Star Wars mod. Galactic Conquest featured, as you can imagine, all the canon units and weapons you'd expect from the Star Wars franchise. Thanks to the Refractor engine, that also meant giant vehicles could be entered and operated. AT-ATs and giant spaceships could both be used while other players moved around freely inside them, featuring infantry being thrown around inside, of course. It goes without saying that this was more fun than 2015's Battlefront, and probably the new Battlefront 2 as well. We can only but see. Galactic Conquest played a little different because the weapons were all laser based. These were actually projectiles rather than hit scan, so combat was a little more refreshing compared to other mods. I checked a trailer on YouTube for this mod, and the last release was version 8.1 in 2015. Spend a couple of minutes looking at gameplay of this on YouTube, it was really something else. Interstate 1982. Well, if you didn't fancy infantry combat, you were in luck because 1982 featured wacky car-to-car combat, available to drive with fast sports cars with weapons, jets and nitro attached. This mod was just nuts. There was a death race map where all drivers had to reach the end of the map, but this wasn't no ordinary track as such. You had hills, jumps and loops, and whoever made it to the end had to capture a single point, and the game would end. The driving physics were incredibly jumpy, and the roads were not roads, but simply painted terrain, meaning lots of bumps that would damage your car's health along the way. Luckily, all classes had the repair wrench, so you could stop along the way and fix your car. It was a mental mod that was a real palate cleanser when you got sick of shooting guns and piloting X-Wings. Check out Interstate 1982 Death Race on YouTube. There's a couple of people who have done the full circuit for your viewing pleasure. And who could forget Battlefield Pirates? Teams of red and blue pirates duked it out with cannons and giant ships. You could control like these little Komodo dragons and chomp at enemy players. It was totally wacky to the extreme. Bodies flying, cannonballs zooming, it was ridiculous, zany fun. I loved that all of the mods featured the same animations and character models from 1942, thanks to the silly limitations of the Refractor engines. The pirates were just German soldiers with bright uniforms, delightfully lazy but charming at the same time. Let me know your favourite mods, or even some obscure ones that I've forgotten. There were some great concepts put to paper that never transpired. Like all things that involve team members working in their free time, they sadly never saw releases. I recall a medieval siege mod, an RTS game bloody thing, goodness knows how they would try and do that in that damn Refractor engine, Action Battlefield was one, where jeeps would have rockets and things. There was loads of stuff that you could find. It was a great time to just find wacky stuff and have fun. My friend remembers a mod where you could control a giant dragon which could drop bombs that made big farting noises, but he can't remember the name. Apparently this was included on a PC Gamer or something similar demo disc. If anyone else heard of this mod, please let me know. I've tried to find the installers for older mods, but a lot of them are no longer hosted due to their age, so apologies for screenshots instead of gameplay for some of these mods. Like Half-Life, each one of these mods had their respective communities and forums. You could be involved in so much, with the only entry ticket being your retail copy of 1942. It was incredible how far the mod teams took the REFRACTOR engine. I remember being so involved in the community. One time I was a moderator of the BF1942 files site, where I would upload files and check for a screenshot of the week submissions. It was a unique sense of importance back then, and to be a teenager again. I loved checking that site for maps and whatnots. Looking back, the mods never felt hugely different in terms of movement and physics because of the engine limitations, but the new content was enough to ignore these quirks. We still had the slidey movement, poor weapon animations and stupid physics, but how can you get angry at pirates being blown up by cannons? The mods never let you down in the fun department. It's irritating that a game from 2002 can do what the newer Battlefields can't, and that's a large scale combat. Sure, Battlefield 1 introduced the big set piece vehicles, but it's not the same when they're not fully player controlled. Every 1942 player remembers controlling the big ships and submarines. These big ships were a bit clunky to handle, but they had hilarious physical glitches. I suppose DICE are afraid of giving this control to the players again and potentially breaking the game's balance. On the Pacific maps, I would go out of my way to hunt the enemy's aircraft carrier and drive it around aimlessly. Even though this was a dick move, there were lots of little things like this that you could do to hinder the enemy. It would be in your best interest to not destroy the enemy's carrier, but keep it moving. Yeah, you guessed it, because the physics would make it impossible for the enemy to take off in their planes. People attempting to take off would slide and smash into the carrier's control tower or be dumped into the water. It was juvenile, knee-slapping fun that can't be had anymore in the newer games, but it wasn't full of malice like spawn camping or team killing. It was a feature. Here's a little tidbit of information that you may not know. On Desert Combat you could actually sink an enemy carrier by shooting the air vents on deck with a rocket launcher or use C4. After a few good hits, it would start to smoke and then it would sink. This was a great little Easter egg because you could hide on the control tower and just toss your C4 down without being seen. Cheeky. I checked this with the version I had installed, but newer, more realistic carriers were modelled for the US team, so this no longer works. Loading up the Pacific maps was always a treat because of the naval combat. If people were hogging the ship's guns like they always did, you could play engineer and heal the ship with your wrench all map if you had a savvy captain. The Pacific maps offered unparalleled gameplay that I've not experienced since. There was no better BF moment than being on a sinking ship and scurrying to the lifeboats. You could be a real action hero and survive a ship sinking. You could jump onto a landcraft and board the enemy's ship. You could climb up the rope ladders to cause havoc on board. When you had enough of being a hero, there were other ways of having fun within Battlefield. I always enjoyed the behind the scenes gameplay away from the front lines, healing vehicles with wrenches, raining down fire support with the artillery, or just being a pest of a plane dropping bombs on AA guns. You could be a real git and sneak to the enemy's main base and steal one of their tanks so it wouldn't spawn for them. There was so much to do gameplay wise, and to think all mods had their own gameplay elements also. We were so spoiled for choice back then. It's just my opinion, but every new Battlefield game launched after 1942 felt like it lost a little what Battlefield was all about in the first place. Every new edition you could do less and less. By the way, I never got 2142 as I hate futuristic guff, but I know this was loved by the community and a newer version is still being sought after to this day. It was only until Battlefield 1, a little more of the Battlefield essence has been reintroduced to the series, but it's still a far way off. Battlefield 3 and 4 did wonders for the infantry gameplay. I remember playing the beta of Battlefield 3 and thinking, wow, we actually have real gunplay like a real FPS game finally. Battlefield 2 was a legendary game, but the gun mechanics were still dog awful like 1942. The advances made in Battlefield 3 and beyond were at the expense of Battlefield's soul. Gone were the large vehicles and what I would call silly gameplay. No more surfing tanks and being blown 20 feet into the air. No Battlefield games are inherently bad, apart from Hardline, but as a day one Battlefielder, I pine for a little more quirkiness in the gameplay. I love seeing glitch videos like the Zeppelin and BF1 being spun uncontrollably. That is, to me, what Battlefield's all about. It was the same when you'd see a battleship glitch in 1942. It breaks up the monotony of this serious tone which doesn't happen nearly enough these days. It's a lot more linear. There's no more stealing vehicles from main bases and being a little turd. I do enjoy the newer games, but fatigue does set in fast start, I will admit. The gaming industry is a larger venture now than it was in 2002, so things are bound to be much more polished in 2017 and beyond. The game has been around for so long now, it has entered classic status, and much like classic movies, they can never be topped. You have to remember 1942 was the first mainstream game to offer open maps and flowing gameplay, which is why it is held in such high regard by players such as myself. 64 players blowing each other up, how could you not love it at the time? We all have our nostalgic games that we love, and Battlefield 1942 is one of my top ones. I only want this series to be the best it can be, and fingers crossed the next one will be grand. Are you a 1942 lover like me, or did one of the later games like 2 or even 3 win you over the original? Oh, P.S. I didn't forget about the 2 expansion packs of 1942, I just didn't fancy including them as the mods did much more impressive things. Although I do have a few fond memories of the Secret Weapons expansion. Sadly, the player count for these packs didn't last very long if memory serves. We all went back to playing Desert Combat and Forgotten Hope. You can still play 1942 online. It involves replacing an exe file which works with the Origin and CD version surprisingly. This opens up servers in the in-game browser and I have tested this. It was good to play with other humans spamming my favourite radio commands once again. So that's it from me. I'll never forget the stupidly fun times I had with Battlefield and its mods. Take a weekend to install 1942 and grab some mods, even if it's to experience the clunkiness of the game engine. To all the old helicopter masters out there, try installing Desert Combat and see how you get on flying. I was pleased to find out that I'm still pretty good in the Apache. Happy days. I hope you enjoyed this little look back at Battlefield 1942. Hopefully it's rejigged some good memories for you. With the new Call of Duty game coming out, I think the industry is going to be turning back to World War II. So here's hoping that Battlefield 1942 is going to be on the horizon to give us World War II lovers a second chance to relive some 1942 memories. It was a goofy, fun-filled ride with lots of variety and a gaming experience that I'll never forget. Thank you for watching.